center studies is really a new way of thinking about the human. But, the human is sort of everything we can think and speak about, as human beings. And so it's really kind of a theory, really a hypothesis about the origin of culture and the implications of the culture and the social and language on, what human beings do. And so we're drawing on a couple of things with center studies, namely mimesis, which was kind of first excavated by, Rene Girard, who sort of, drew it out of antiquity and literature and really saw mimesis as the operating principle of the human being. We're always imitating. Mimesis means kind of to imitate. And so, whether it's the words we say or the gestures we use or even the way we think, we're always kind of drawing on models who have thought or said or moved that way prior. And, if you look at kids and watch how they learn language or really learn anything, it's very obvious that they're just kind of these hyper imitative beings. I think Girard actually called them something like they had like a copying machine. Like that's what the head was, like a giant copying machine. And so, and then as we get older, we kind of construct these identities and we sort of forget about mimesis. And especially I think in modernity, it's easy to, forget that imitation is core to what we are. But what center studies tries to do is start with mimesis and start at the beginning and say, okay, what is the human being doing differently than all these other beings? Because the human, has the capacity for language. Terence Deacon has a book called The Symbolic Species, which I've always thought was kind of a nice way to put it, right? We are a being that can speak and has a kind of conscious notion of signs and reference. And so, again, center studies is kind of a hypothesis of how do you get to that? How do you go from an animal that might have sophisticated communication, but doesn't have language, doesn't have representation, to the human being that does all these kind of amazing things that humans do, like record podcasts or watch podcasts or ask the question of why we have language, and how do you kind of bridge that gap and make that jump? And, if center studies can provide a kind of minimal scientific parsimonious hypothesis for that leap, that hypothesis becomes a way of thinking through everything human, because now we have kind of a model of what it takes to make that leap. And then all the kind of leaps we continue to do, the kind of leaps of faith in every word we say, in every conversation we have, and in every kind of project we take up. And so, yes, center studies is a hypothesis about the origin of the human, about the origin of language, and really it's a way of thinking. With that.
And if I jump in, so this is really interesting. So it's a way of understanding. If we can understand more properly the nature of culture, language, and mimesis, it kind of helps place us today. Like, how do we understand our modern world? But then what you're trying to do is also go, okay, and if we can understand the origins of these kinds of concepts themselves, of language, of culture, then we can sort of also place us, like, not just sort of here thrown into the world, but like how did even culture start? How did we even get language in the first place? When we talked off the air, it was really interesting when we discussed, most animals have a kind of this dominance hierarchy where you have a kind of an alpha male, right? And there are still hierarchies in human relations, but things get kind of, like, how do you suddenly come into a community? How do you stop violence and start all these interesting things that culture is, as you say, start making podcasts eventually? I don't know, that's really cool. Just I really liked can you talk about that, like how
Totally. Well, it's a great
that unique human experience?
Yeah, the unique human experience. I mean, that's right. That's the human condition in a sense. But by the way, I love the way you kind of set that up, right? How do you go from the animal hierarchies, the animal dominance hierarchies, to the human community? One kind of figural way of thinking about it that I mentioned on our last call was you kind of go from this triangle to the circle, right? So you're kind of moving from a strict animal dominance hierarchy with an alpha, beta, gamma, etc. And again, you see this in wolf packs, primate, groups, any sort of kind of more hierarchically organized, higher primate. This is the way it basically works is, the alpha can get challenged by, a lower, sort of member of the group, but there's kind of a singular hierarchy in that way. Human beings, while a lot of anthropologists have pointed out the similarities between, human hierarchies and animal hierarchies. They're much more complex. I mean, infinitely more complex. I mean, think about, kingdoms and democracies and, just again, all the relationships we have they're basically oriented around a center. So you can think about every conversation as having a kind of center. Like example, I'm speaking right now and I sort of in a sense have the center. And if you were to interrupt me, you would sort of be at the center. And there's kind of a periphery, kind of watching that center. Again, if you think about like a speech someone gives where they sort of place themselves at the center and are surrounded by people, there's this center periphery dynamic in human relations, which is not strictly egalitarian, but has kind of a bit more of a kind of, centripetal dimension to it. And again,
Mm.
animal hierarchies don't have this. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and in animal hierarchies, I mean, would you say the alpha male has the center? Like what, or is this because when we say the center, we kind of mean something like the shared attention. So maybe it's not even right to say that. It's more like there just isn't the center can't move or anything.
Yeah, well, you're right to kind of call it shared attention. I mean, that's really what the center does, is it's the thing that draws in our attention. The center compels us. So the reason you're watching this podcast, or the reason you and I are speaking to each other right now, is somehow we've been compelled to do so. We've kind of felt obligated, and we're in a sense just kind of following our attention where it leads us. Like it's less that sort of I'm deciding where to go as much as something's continually drawing me towards the next thing I'm paying attention to. And that's the center. It's kind of the ultimate reference point. And again, the thing that makes the human being unique is our capacity for shared attention. So, there's a concept of kind of first order attention, I see you, second order attention, I see you seeing something else. And then third order attention, I see you seeing me, seeing you. Or really, I see you seeing the same thing I'm seeing. Kind of a capacity to let something be, to share attention, to kind of let it just hold it there and not take it. Again, that's a thing only human beings do. I mean, a model of this is basically grace before a meal, a kind of holding back and waiting before kind of devouring the object. Or, Christmas Day, there's a bunch of presents and everyone kind of holds back, sometimes for like months prior to Christmas before you kind of tear in on Christmas Day, or, Thanksgiving. It's everyone kind of waits. And it would be very inappropriate to kind of like lunge in and grab the turkey before anything started. Again, that's a human thing. It's a kind of an ability to kind of let things be. And that's kind of what the center originates as. Again, animals can't do that. Only human beings kind of have this free won't, this kind of ability to hold back, let something be, and then kind of share it. Again, this is, and if you think about how parents speak with children when children are learning kind of social rules and social norms, they might say something like, use your words, don't fight. Teaching children how to share is a really kind of basic human thing. And this ability to share and to kind of hold back and use language and culture in the social is it's this unique human capacity.
Interesting, yeah. So the shared attention capacity is a kind of this thing which is uniquely human and makes us what we are, and it's this ability to postpone what is kind of instinctually obvious, like or I mean, and
That's
sometimes
right.
you feel like as a kid, your Christmas Day, like, I just sometimes like or kids will they don't have polite manners and start eating the food, but it's again like that you're going against something, and it's not really a thing. It's a weird one. It's a shared attention, but nevertheless, like for humans, it's that shared attention is a really real thing. So when you
Hmm.
violate it, like it's it's really something. Um, I wanted like, and then I'm thinking of all these things like, okay, shared attention, and then so there's something like the center there. Like, what is that thing that binds us with that shared attention, which isn't weirdly we can actually put our attention beyond any one of us. Whereas I feel like maybe in the dominance hierarchies of animals, that's maybe not really the case. Like
Yeah,
we're sort of all in here. There's no distance. In our conceptual thinking of like the kind of situation we're in. Um, and so you have like thinking about then because that this makes us think, okay, uniquely human. It's helpful then to like even apply that to like on one day, but like something like language is like something the center studies thinks a lot about. Like how should we think about that in relation to this, and how language sort of creates culture and like creates us and who we are.
sure, sure. I mean, in a sense, language is a big word, but language is the thing we start with. Language, again, this capacity for symbolic representation, to have signs and reference, and the ability to iterate on signs. This is the unique kind of human thing that, again, breaks us out of that triangular animal dominance hierarchy and shifts us into a community that shares a word initially, shares kind of a single sign, and then ultimately builds into this kind of hyper complex, modern 21st century world that we're living in that's, kind of this gigantic stack of scenes. So we start kind of with an initial singular scene, kind of everyone oriented around a central object, and basically making a sign that says something like, hold back, right? So the kind of way center studies sets this up is we have a model of the first scene or the first event. Again, this is kind of a key dimension here, is that language doesn't come out of simple biological evolution. It's actually it's an event that must have taken place, And we can always hypothesize about what exactly it was, but something like this must have happened to be able to speak the way we're speaking now. And so there was this, Eric Gons, basically this UCLA professor in the 80s, who was actually, the first PhD student of Rene Girard, and was sort of grounded in Girard's notions of mimesis and scapegoating. He sort of realized the problem with Girard was that Girard didn't have a theory of language. And by that he meant Girard didn't have a reason why these animals would be conscious of the pointing at the victim. If you're familiar with Girard, it's basically a scapegoating dynamic where everyone kind of points at a victim, there's an emissary murder, and then that kind of murder founds the community. But the question is, animals kill singular individuals of their groups often, right? And there's no communal founding in religious experience. And so if you want that, you have to have language first, or at least some minimal notion of signs and symbolic capacities. And Girard didn't have a theory of that. And so it's not that Girard was sort of wrong about the scapegoating dynamic. It's just that before you have that, you must have signs, you must have language, you must have representation. And so Gons got to thinking that you didn't actually need this whole scapegoating and killing. You needed something much, much more minimal. Something more like a group of proto-hominids converging together on an object of shared desire, probably a carcass of an animal or some kind of food object that they were all interested in, appropriating and getting their own piece of. And they're all probably, hypermimetic. So they're converging simultaneously in a way that the animal dominance hierarchy, that kind of alpha versus the group, cannot hold back, because every single animal is so imitative. They basically they look like each other as they kind of converge, kind of accelerating towards the object. And it's possible that in certain cases, this just turned into kind of a flurry of like blood and tooth and claw, and it was an extremely violent tearing apart of this central object. But at least once, we have to imagine that as they kind of converged and the violence escalated, that one of the proto hominids, primates, basically kind of his gesture of appropriation, reaching out, was kind of pulled back and maybe converted into something more like a point. And another one would have noticed that and also pointed, and everyone would have kind of made the gesture. And then that would have been this kind of massively game changing, game theoretically changing
Mm.
moment where they realize that they don't, they can hold back, that there is a mode of kind of coordination that was not possible previously that they're now participating in. And none of them kind of consciously would have thought this. They would have been compelled to do it in a sense. And then they probably kind of devoured the object, but maybe as the violence escalated during the devouring, they issued the sign again, and everyone kind of held back for a moment. And then they developed. And then this would have been an extremely powerful memory. This would have been something that later, maybe, days, weeks, even months later, in a similar situation, they could have issued the sign again. They would have all pointed and
Mm.
held back. And now they have slowly and increasingly this representational capacity that begins to eat its way through everything else they're doing, until the point now where we're kind of so fundamentally embedded in the symbolic world that it's all we're ever doing.
Right.
But that's the origin. That's something like that is the hypothesis about the origin of language. With
I
that
like that.
point, that origin.
Go on.
Yeah.
Go. Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I like that. Hypothesis for the origin of language, and then like sometimes if someone's listening to this, maybe they think this is kind of imaginative, like it's like why this story, but it's interesting because it makes me think of reason why it makes it plausible to me is like if you think about Rene Girard and you linked it to mimesis, it's like I think you kind of also can see in even social situations sometimes like there isn't like a full scale like breakdown and devouring of like something which we can't like agree cordially with language to do. There's sometimes you can have like these almost implicit things of like I do something kind of against you, or like that's I don't know, I just, or we all kind of mutually agree that like we're doing something against, I don't know, social kind of rules. I'm not sure. It's
Well, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but let me give you one example, which is just like the last piece of pizza or kind of the last slice of
mm,
cake, which still today, if that happens, if like everyone's eating and there's one, like no one really wants to touch it, there's some like weird sacred dynamic to and also the first piece. So it's like first and last, right?
mm,
And so that's a reminiscence of that originary scene where we're all kind of oriented around a shared object of desire, and there's something sacred about it. Again, this is the
right.
meal, this is the distribution, and this has to scale all the way up and down. To speak about scale just for a moment, again, one of the problems with Girard's theory of scapegoating is it doesn't really scale. it's kind of a model of a group of what, 10, 20, 100, 1,000 people. I don't know how big it could get, but the scapegoating dynamics that work at that scale are not the same scapegoating dynamics that work in a world of 8 billion people and intelligence agencies and social media accounts and 21st century military capacities. That's just not how scapegoating works anymore. Again, it doesn't mean scapegoating is not happening, but we need a hypothesis and a model of the social that can both explain a 3-person dynamic and explain an 8 billion person mega structure dynamic, and kind of use the same vocabulary all the way up and down. So we need a very minimal set of concepts that can kind of inflate and deflate as we need them. And that's kind of what center studies attempts to offer, is really a new vocabulary for thinking about, again, the last slice of cake and 21st century, global intelligence networks. Like, if you can't sort of work through every layer of the stack, then ultimately your theory sort of should be discarded, because again, we have to be able to think about everything human in kind of a coherent manner. And so, by starting at the origin, that's what we hope to do. And we hope that origin gets us to the ends, kind of like I mentioned first and last earlier. The origins and the ends are sort of connected. And so we need kind of a thread through it all. And language or representation is that thing we can always come back to. We can sort of never run out of things to say if we're speaking about language.
Yeah, when I heard you speak to the psychologist Greg, and because you guys talk about this, this kind of conception of language emerging, and then the reciprocal emerging of language and culture simultaneously, because I guess now you can like start using signs, you start opening up the shared space, and then you can ask questions, like when you get kind of a kind of language, or wait, I think this, is this, and then talk about, is that true? Or, we can like say, like, why don't we, consider doing this or that thing, rather than, I guess, just the obvious thing that is here and now. And so it's making me even think about like long-term planning and just.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, once you have this first word, this ability to hesitate, right? This ability to kind of negate your instinctual biological, kind of acceleration towards an object, and you can actually decelerate, and you can kind of wait a moment. And that is the foothold you need to ultimately get towards civilizational complex planning over days, months, decades, and centuries. I mean, in a sense, we can almost define civilization as kind of this increasing capacity for deferral. And I want to use this word deferral. I don't think I've used the word yet. One of the kind of punchlines in a sense of center studies is language is the deferral of violence, right? What language does is it defers violence, at least temporarily, such that we have the space to operate and maybe defer it again and defer it again and keep deferring it, such that now it becomes totally unthinkable. Because if violence becomes totally unthinkable, somehow it's going to get violent, right? It needs to be kind of on the in the back of our minds that that's always a potential threat, but you can defer it further and further out. And again, this is kind of what civilization and complex social orders do, and healthy cultures do. I mean, there's a great quote I think about startups, which is, startups don't die from homicide, they die from suicide. Right? The reason startups tend to fail is because the group dynamics actually don't work. It gets too crazy and people get jealous and things break down within the actual group. Right? What you have to be able to do to have a healthy culture is kind of defer the violence, defer the ends of that culture farther and farther out, such that the culture can actually go out and kind of expand. And so, this sign was the initial deferral. It's a sign everyone shared and could defer to the violence then. And all of our kind of cultural artifacts and sophistications that we build up over the kind of, centuries and millennia after that are increasingly complex and sophisticated modes of those violent deferral capacities.
Right. That's and so yeah, it's making me think of Menedrat and Mimesis, and the way. So you're it's interesting to put the pieces together of like, okay, so language is like a minimum viable way of thinking about Girard, but because then I guess I am interested in thinking about how to get from like the start and origins of language and culture to like something like where we are today. Because yeah, it's interesting whether it's the scale of even the company or like culture. Like for Girard, it's like you have to have some founding thing that starts, and so it's interesting, like that violence is deferred, but if it's completely forgotten, it's like almost like you lose the identity of the thing. Like, for example, imagine you're in a company, right, and you guys think it's going to end, so then people start doing their own thing. They start using the company for their own ends because it's like almost like a piece of meat that you're just going to use for yourself, right?
Exactly.
And because
Right. I mean, and think
this whole
about
identity is destroyed.
think about the social order today, right? It's like you have this kind of giant social carcass. And the question is kind of, are we just going, and you can really model it on that originary scene. There's a word called the sparagmos, which is the kind of moment where they're tearing into the social body and all trying to kind of grab their piece. And it's kind of violent. And the question is kind of, are we reaching the point where it's just kind of this violent sparagmos where, like you said, the social body's getting torn apart. And the game theory, again, is kind of breaking down here, becomes kind of every man for himself versus a kind of a kind of founding moment that's extended where we're kind of all contributing and donating our resentment, donating our resources towards the center, so that the center can keep distributing and keep providing and kind of this perpetual social creation that the human being is capable of. And when that starts to break down, it can kind of accelerate and break down even faster. Um, and we want to be paying attention to those dynamics. There's always a mode of distribution that
Mm.
the center is kind of enacting, and you want it to be kind of an extremely long-term mode, one where we're really thinking about millennia in the future, leaving traces and kind of making words and movements and gestures that could kind of be picked up down the line, even if we don't know exactly how or why, instead of kind of just surging in now to kind of get what's ours. Again, it scales it from that scene to, even the podcast. Any project kind of has these dynamics within it.
Right. If anything isn't just like this immensely short term thing, you're like, even implicitly you're thinking about like, how am I going to sustain this kind of project, this kind of means of sustaining myself like longer term, and like how is this helping like society, like other people, why are people giving me this attention? And it's interesting, like when you say these kinds of things, it makes me think of like climate change debates and the way in which it's like, do we all like what, because we can't, there's no, it's like it seems like the wrong level of analysis almost, or something, such that like some people go, hey, let's all, we know what to do to solve this problem, let's all cut CO2, etc., etc., and then some people are like, yeah, we'll do that, and then like not really doing it. It's like weird. So it's like, yeah, do we all just like um have a short term view, enjoy things now, versus like it's versus the longer term, and that's like, how long in the future are we supposed to be thinking about, and like, can we all coherently agree with each other like on, because it always points outwards beyond that one scene, like the climate change debate. It's always like beyond that, like what kind of thing do we think civilization is, and like are
Yes.
we, and then therefore like a capacity for like how in general can we associate with each other and agree
No,
on
that's,
things.
that's
And
exactly right. I mean, climate change, there's a term, the poly crisis, and you may be familiar with this, right? There's kind of all these kind of multi crises that are kind of happening at once, right? You can look at kind of the breakdown of liberal democracy, the climate kind of, crisis. I would say there's like a nutritional crisis in certain ways. There's, we kind of come with all these things. It's not new, in human history to kind of have a poly crisis, but certainly it feels like, there are these planetary scale crises that are kind of novel. And we need kind of new ways of thinking through planetary governance and planetary computation. And I'm kind of drawing on some of Benjamin Bratton's work here, and the notion of the stack, this kind of accidental megastructure that we've created. We've kind of wrapped the globe in, undersea cables and satellites and an internet and, air travel and sort of all these ways in which we're extremely connected in a global way. And that presents both these kind of crises and these opportunities. But again, the human being is the one creature that can kind of invent its way out of crises using new ways of thinking and new ways of speaking. And so, again, whether it's climate change or whatever we want to speak about, it's kind of the project of the human to kind of think through the possibilities here and ways of getting after. I mean, one kind of, I think this was a Bratton project. They suggested, someone kind of drew out the designs for this, um, global carbon sequestration pyramids that would take up some, large percentage of global GDP. I forget what it was. Maybe it's like 20%, but it would be like a global project where everyone would have to build these giant pyramids, and it would sort of employ all these people and sequester the carbon. And, whether or not we think that's the most important thing to do, it's an interesting way of thinking. Like, what are these global scale mega projects? Like, I think, a lot of what Elon's trying to do with sort of getting us to space, again, it's thinking in these civilizational terms where you kind of get the entire social order in on a project that, both kind of provides meaning, provides kind of material, technological development, and kind of orients us in these kind of meaningful human teams such that we could, coordinate and kind of live up to our potentiality, which is really infinite. You really can do way more than we can imagine as a human being. And the way we do that is we kind of coordinate on these long-term projects.
Mm. And in that, this quest for like setting, because when you set things up like this, it's then what is the most long-term mode we could all take up with each other, as you say, right? And that makes it me feel like it's inherently kind of a religious kind of thing. Like it's like,
Yep.
if rather than just understanding the world in like, let's say, in a scientific way of, exactly how do we understand the mechanics of it, or like how do we use it to do any one particular thing. It's what kind of orientation should we all take to keep this game going, like kind of as
Well,
long as possible.
religion has provided an answer to this question like, if you look at kind of the Middle Ages, kind of the entire social order, at least in like, Christianized Europe, is kind of interested in, glorifying God. It's kind of this like central project, and you're building these cathedrals, and it's just kind of the vocabulary and the way everyone's thinking and speaking. Um, and there is kind of this coherent thing. And one of the things I think liberalism does is it basically makes these kinds of grand scale projects almost impossible to think, because the basic concept is you have kind of these self-interested desires that society should not kind of impose on you, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. Kind of you're willing to endeavor on your own projects, but there can't really be a supervening project we're all kind of participating in. So it's kind of, from the start, it's not really possible. And so again, I think what center studies would want to do is kind of help us come up with these projects. And space is one example, but I'm interested as well in something Adam Katz, who's he writes under the name Dennis Bouvard, and we can link his Substack. He's pointed out to me, which is kind of a notion of, instead of just going out, going in, right? So both into language, into biology, into kind of the oceans, and into the forests, and kind of what kind of communication with nature is possible using kind of our capacities and the kind of infinite possibilities of nature itself that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of, right? And so I think that can go a lot of different directions. And there's actually a woman named Neri Oxman, who I think is at MIT, who's been kind of working on some of this kind of communication. But I think these are the kind of infinite prospects and infinite endeavors we'd want to be kind of teaming up on as human beings. And so, I'm happy to go to Mars. In fact, that sounds, fascinating if people want to kind of do that. But I think as well, kind of going in and seeing what on Earth is possible and potential, and just projects of this ilk are the kind of orientations that I think will be necessary to kind of continue deferring violence and building sophisticated civilizations in the 21st century. Yeah.
Interesting. Like it's a couple of things. I mean, one is, like, will the project, like, going to Mars, going to outer space, like, because it makes me think of Rene Girard, like, will that unify us, but temporarily? Like is that
Well,
a
yeah,
similar kind of?
it's never utopian, right? None of these things will ever solve the human condition. It's always temporary. It's always just violence deferred. So there's never a moment where you can say, got it, done, and we're good. And now, no. As soon as you say that, there's someone's like, why'd you say it that way? And it's, things start to break down again, right? So we can increase our capacities for the deferral of violence. And by the way, we've already increased it immensely. I mean, think about kind of the wealth and technology that's been created for you and I to have this conversation. It's incredible, So we've done a good job with this, but we're also drawing on moral resources of things like, Christianity, and just this kind of infinite and even in a sense unnameable moral capacities and gestures and language and kind of cultural norms that have been built up over, again, centuries, millennia, etc. So those are kind of the bank we're kind of drawing on. And there's a question of, are we kind of depositing back into that bank, or are we just kind of drawing down those resources in this kind of man versus all, one versus society dynamic that you mentioned earlier? Again, we'd really want to think about creating new deposits in this like moral reservoir of kind of violence deferral, and generating new idioms and new ways of speaking and kind of really creative ways of thinking that kind of strike people as kind of both perplexing but also compelling, such that violence could kind of get deferred, at least in that moment, and we could again begin to think new in new ways. And so that again is kind of always going to be the project. There'll never be a moment where you could say, we're done, in a sense, which, is both good and bad, but yeah.
And so we talked about a bit about off the air, actually, because part of the human condition is this origin and emergence from language initially, and like a sign, and then like what to be able to use new language and actually come up with new kinds of terms and creatively think about this shared attention we all share is itself of like a creative act. Like it's
Mm,
something which I can actually engender like new, oh, we didn't realize that was a kind of thing we could put our attention on, like okay. And then and if you know that language sticks, like people find something interesting about that, and it's not just that they happen to be using a new term, it's like it's pointing to something like almost a real new thing in the world's being created, like a new thing that we could actually, you know, start producing
work it.
together, something which could bind long-term interests.
Absolutely. I mean, you're sort of creating a new name or a new term that then you can start to orient around. You've kind of generated a new center. You've done something fundamentally creative and unique, and then that becomes kind of mimetic and kind of becomes a network, actually, in a sense, and a team, and then maybe a civilization, you know. And this is again, this is the fundamental thing that humans can do that other creatures can't do, because we have to do it. Because if we don't do it, we're the only creature that is capable of kind of, again, this kind of cultural suicide, like killing itself because of our mimetic natures. But again, the redemption of that is that those same mimetic natures enable this creative capacity. And so, yeah, I think one of the imperatives you kind of get from the center, the kind of command the center is telling us all to do, is to kind of continue that perpetual creation, continue coming up with new names, new ways of thinking, new idioms, that maybe not today, maybe not even a decade, but maybe 15 years from now or something, can get picked up by someone else and kind of continue this project. And so that's, again,
Mm.
always the imperative.
What do you think of Rene Girard and thinking about Jesus Christ and Christianity as a kind of ending of the scapegoat mechanism of this? Like I was thinking about the Eucharist recently. Of you, so one actually eats the blood and body of Christ, so it's simultaneously the
A
God,
little
but you're
reminiscent of the
consuming it.
originary scene, by the way, if you ever put that hat on, you know, right? It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
the shared consumption of the body in a very ritualized manner. But yeah, no, I mean, Jesus Christ is extremely important for, I mean, for center studies, but you know, just that the Christian moral innovation. Um, I think first by kind of the Hebrews through their, sort of invention or discovery of monotheism, the kind of understanding that the sacred that was being kind of recognized by all these different people was the same sacred. That there was kind of a transcendental sacred behind. And so, I mean, one of the kind of points that Eric Gons kind of highlights in a really short and profound book called Science and Faith that he wrote is that the name of the Hebrew God is a sentence. So when Moses kind of asks, Yahweh for the name, that God's name is I am that I am, which is kind of an uninvocable name, because it's not like Zeus or something where you can say, I'm going to give you this, you give me that. The name is a sentence. It can't really be sacrificed to, in a sense. And then Christ kind of completes that kind of revelation, such that you enter a kind of post-sacrificial world where even donating the kind of most valuable thing possible, human life, isn't enough. And Christ kind of exhausts that model of sacrifice, such that we now enter a post-sacrificial era. And so we're kind of in this axial, post-axial age where sacrifice, the idea that I'm going to go like kill a chicken and that's going to help me with my test tomorrow, it's just absurd, right? That's not really a way anybody, at least in the modern world, is really thinking. That's how you sort of know that worked. But then we have a new set of questions, like with everything. And so now, if we're in a post-sacrificial age, what does it mean to, one thing I would say is the economy ends up becoming kind of a sacrificial entity itself, where we can think about sacrificing our time and energy and resources in exchange for other modes of time and energy and resource. And we sort of scapegoat this kind of new deity, the economy. Like if you think about the 2008 financial crisis, it's like, things start to go awry and you kind of bring all the high priests into a room and you sort of make these sacrifices to kind of get the thing going again. And again, this looks a lot like the way you would have imagined sacrificing to like rain gods or something similar, right? And so we're always drawing on the vocabulary and idioms and ways of thinking that we've inherited, right? But the way we sort of kind of continually generate new ways and new capacities of thinking, um, is going to be necessary to kind of, kind of coordinate in this post-sacrificial world. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but the Christ event is an important, thing, specifically that it inaugurates this post-sacrificial age, which we're still in.
Would you say that before that post-sacrificial age, and so what is sacrifice doing? Is it kind of going like, because we're always having to defer? It's saying like I'm actively giving this thing up, and
Yeah,
therefore
there's
because it's always something like you want something in return.
yeah, in a sacrificial, when you can sacrifice to the center, and it kind of works in this in the sacrificial era. Um, you can do things like, yeah, I said, kill a chicken, or sort of bring these sacrifices to the center. In a post-sacrificial era, that stops working, and the question kind of becomes, what does the center want from me? You kind of enter this new mode of imperative interrogativity, where the question is kind of, what would Jesus do, or kind of what would the center do, or kind of what kind of models can I take up such that I can obey what the center is telling me to do in a higher order manner.
Mm.
And so the question kind of becomes who my models should be, less so than like kind of what should I sacrifice. And so I think there's a notion of, and I kind of, the emulative economy, kind of rethinking of economics as a question of modeling and kind of orienting yourselves around new kinds of models. So you're kind of always in these lineages of mimesis. Again, kind of like apprenticeships are kind of a model of this. And again, the point of mimesis is never that it's all bad. In fact, most of it must be pretty good, because we're doing kind of healthy forms of mimesis all the time. And so how can we kind of, increasingly choose our models and model ourselves on people and ideas and idioms that are kind of generative and productive, instead of, the opposite.
Yeah, let's speak more about then economics and that way in which, yeah, in a fashion, it kind of is something which takes on a thing which we can kind of, when we talked off the air, we talked about the economy as, it's a thing which we kind of agree, like, if I come and take your things, this is not workable, right? Like things break down. But if we use money as something, we go like, actually, that's fine. You earn loads of money now. You can just buy like all of my town if you're that rich. But like we agree that like this thing money, like you can only earn it in some like fair way, and so we agree if you have loads of money, or fair enough. Like it's this currency
Yeah.
by which. Mm,
Yeah. Money is a very strange thing. It's a very human thing. There's a essay that I wrote with Adam called, there is no economy, but only the debt to the center. And so we sort of try to rethink a lot of economic concepts and kind of, neoliberal economic paradigms in terms of center studies. And one of the things we sort of trace is the origin and emergence and kind of transformations of currency and money over time. And, it really begins, I think there's sort of, in a sense, multiple origins, but one of the ways is, sacrifice in temples, right? Bringing kind of tokens for sacrifice. And so there's something strange about fiat currency. I mean, I think fiat, I think it literally is just from the, Genesis, where, God sort of, creates the world by fiat. So it's sort of a, declaration of the value of this thing. And then it's always kind of closely coordinated to sort of nation states in the modern time. And there's now emergence of money, things like Bitcoin, that at least are, in principle, stateless currencies that are kind of more like, belief is a kind of much more important part of the way Bitcoin works than it is for something like the US dollar. So we sort of try to trace all this out and kind of use new ways and new vocabularies for thinking about all of this. But yeah, money is, one thing we try to think of is the end of money, right? So if we're thinking about the origin of currency, we also want to think about what would it look like to be in a social order without money. This happens right now. I mean, you and I aren't paying each other to do this interview, but in a sense, there is a data exchange going on between us, right? You're teaching me things, I'm teaching you things. There's a pedagogical dynamic. We're sort of getting sort of paid in currencies that aren't US dollars for the kind of activities we're doing. And so one of the things that Adam and I sort of theorize is data exchange and data as currency. And could it be that we enter a social order where dollars are sort of a very low fidelity way of, paying each other money, but actually data becomes the way we all think about kind of our exchanges with each other, and then ultimately with the center. So the center is sort of interested in us as well. It wants to know things about, our health or our nutrition. Maybe the state wants a healthier population, or something like that. And so you kind of imagine donating data, to the center, something again we're kind of already doing in a way, and it giving us data back. And then you sort of rethink the entire social order in terms of data exchanges. And so that would be one way of considering the ends of money.
Because like money kind of only means something in relation to like I think about evolutionary psychology, and you hear like people talk about why does say even money make someone attractive? It doesn't seem actually to be exactly about like you physically have like a certain number of units. It's more like almost to the degree to which it points to like this greater competence of you, or like it must kind of point to other aspects to be meaningful. And so it's like in some ways today, like money is so preeminent because you can kind of buy anything with it, and it's such a good way to like think about the way in which we kind of exchange with other people. But it's not the only way, right?
It's not the only way, right? I mean, like I said, we're demonstrating, and in a family, obviously, you're not paying your parents every time they make you dinner, right? There's sort of these lower levels, but then again, when we're thinking about scale, it's how do you scale that to even to the highest levels, such that maybe it's kind of teams who are sort of subscribing to each other, both subscribing resources, maybe talent, maybe ways of training and teaching, and ultimately, we really kind of think currency almost becomes learning itself. Like there's this notion that learning is really the currency of what the human being does. It's this kind of pedagogical token, these kind of teacher student relationships that are always happening. And then almost that could be money. Like that's the most valuable thing. And so what would it look like if the entire social order was oriented around kind of a learn coin, a kind of way of teaching each other and kind of reorienting teams around, specific, ways of teaching and speaking and learning and doing and you know, that's a possible orientation for a social order, and it would move us past kind of the current, capital liberal paradigm of kind of state debt as the kind of, churning forces that sort of coordinate the social order into something totally novel and also uncharted, right? So there would be all these possibilities if we were to do something like that, and new crises that we couldn't have imagined in our current sort of mode of coordinating. Um, yeah.
It is really interesting. Like I even want to, I don't know if you've had much thought into it practically, because you seem to have thought about things like say Bitcoin or money, and like it's a funny thing because it's kind of a phase transition in the sense of thinking about society, right? Like we thought about things as like there's companies, there's governments, there's nations, and I just wonder what the future kind of looks like what kind of thing like the nations need to exist if information is way more important, people can move about. Like what kind of new entities come about, and I don't understand that
Currency,
world.
we historically we've been in a world of multiple currencies, right? And increasingly that kind of is homogenized, kind of like a currency monotheism or something like that. And there's sort of all these specific economic things we'd have to talk about, around sort of like this, the US dollar, for example, is kind of the global reserve currency. But I think there's a world where community currencies and kind of ways for communities to sort of kind of coordinate and really kind of go long themselves become a new mode of coordination where you sort of get almost a smaller economy within kind of a community that kind of again bets on itself and trades with itself and resources with itself, and kind of in a sense goes short other institutions that they're not interested in, kind of helping, right? And again, long the things they are interested in helping. And so that becomes kind of a mode of coordination potentially. And then you'd have these currency exchanges, which would also be kind of language exchanges and really idiom exchanges, because the question would be sort of what are they up to? And then again, you get the teaching and learning. And so again, money and language and coordination all sort of convene on each other, along with technology as well, because these things could be on blockchains or they could not be. I mean, there's many ways of imagining the way these currencies sort of operate, but language, technology, and currency sort of start to become inextricably almost converted into one another.
Very interesting. And like so it's going long your own currency. So it maybe would be helpful to actually understand because I thought a bit about the US dollar, but like, so I guess you would think about it as they're going short their own currency. They're kind of using it
Well,
up
you
to
could
get other
imagine,
things.
yeah, you could imagine. I mean, you see what's happening right now with like El Salvador, and they're kind of going along Bitcoin. They're kind of trying to see Bitcoin as a model of new modes of sovereignty. And maybe that's a good model. I think time will tell. But you could also imagine like a political party issuing their own currency and, kind of trading it amongst each other and kind of subsidizing their own operations with their own kind of currency reserves. And, there's a million pragmatic questions about how exactly you do that. But you could imagine something like that, and they accept donations in the currency and they pay people in the currency. And then that becomes kind of a new model of, what it means to sort of have, political parties are, they're sort of, they only, political parties are not eternal things, right? In fact, in this essay that I mentioned, There Is No Economy but Only the Debt to the Center, Adam and I trace the origin to kind of the emergence of the first central bank in England, and the origin of kind of the Tory and the Whigs, which is really sort of still or modeling the kind of Democrats and Republican Party on. And so, if that's the origin, if central banking and political parties are kind of inextricably linked, you sort of have to imagine the end is central banking as kind of inextricably linked to the end of political parties themselves. And so, again, you can imagine currency being an important piece of sort of how these things all play out. But it'll take speculative projects and belief and people and, high agency individuals willing to kind of try this stuff. And a lot of it will not work. But kind of like on the originary scene, like, you sort of have to give it a shot. And sometimes this sign you issue does get taken up. There is kind of a mimetic, deceleration, a network gets created, a name that gets created, and then, everything changes.
This is great. I really like that. Like we started it kind of like thinking about the origins of language culture, and brought in Gerard and Mimesis. And we covered everything. We covered Jesus Christ as well, Christianity, and the future. Anything
Yeah.
more you want to say? Like any other comments as we end this?
No, I've really loved this. I've loved this conversation. I think one thing about center studies is it's, in a sense, it's overwhelming. And then in a sense, it's almost really minimal and almost not enough. It's kind of this maximality and this minimality, right? And so in a conversation like this, it's always, sort of a challenge and kind of, but also exciting as a way to kind of introduce it. But I hope people who are listening just kind of think, okay, this is at a minimum an interesting new way of thinking. And what are some of the vocabulary or idioms I could sort of pick up by kind of going a little bit deeper? I mean, maybe one way of thinking about it I've been playing with is, there's this notion that if you learn a new language, it really changes the way you think. Because you kind of learn all these idioms and vocabulary that you didn't have in the language you already learned. So I think center studies is, if you imagine almost like two dimensions, and one is like difficulty of the language, and one is like new ways of thinking because you learned it. It is way easier to learn than learning a new language, and will give you way more new ways of thinking than learning another language. So it's sort of like the highest leverage language learning possible. It's only a kind of handful of concepts and kind of just a hypothesis about the origin. But if you can really take it up and work it into your thinking, it will totally reorient the way you approach really everything human. And it's really the most powerful way of thinking and one of the strangest sort of things I've ever come across. And so, yeah, I think if people are interested, I'd love to talk to them. I'd love to share more about it. And again, I just really appreciate you, being interested in learning more as well.
Yeah, and it's like any intellectual kind of paradigm and ways of thinking, like and this is why I'm so interested in like talking to interesting people, is that like it kind of changes and like infects in a good way the way you think and see the world, and then that kind of, so it never no then conversation after that is kind of the same, because you kind
That's
of
right.
come at it kind of a new way. So you in the Center Studies that you just recently made a Twitter account, is that right? And so where
Yeah,
can people find you?
there's a Twitter account now if you want to kind of see some of the. I'm sort of excerpting different things and ways of thinking on the Twitter account. It's at center study underscore. And there's a website, centerstudycenter.xyz. And yeah, if you want to learn more, I would encourage you to check that out. And I often run little reading groups and discussion groups with Jack. You should definitely join if you'd like to. But, it's like fun to kind of try to take, a blog post or two and just discuss it with the group and sort of, what's interesting, what doesn't make any sense, and sort of work it through together. The way you learn anything new is you try it out and you make a bunch of mistakes, and then you start kind of innovating with the concepts. And yeah, it's also more fun with friends. So always
Yeah,
happy.
yeah. As my friends know, when I read a new book, they unfortunately have to start hearing me speak about it for
Yeah.
4 hours.
If you
Um,
think if you've got that bad, wait till you talk to my friends. They're like, the center again. I'm like, yeah,
oh God, no, please. Perfect.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah,
thank you, Zach.
this was a blast. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.